Hi, everybody. My name is Brendan O'Reilly. I'm the president of the Press Club of Long Island. We are a chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. You can learn more about us on our website, pcli.org. You could follow Press Club of Long Island on Facebook, Press Club of LI on Instagram, and at PCLI on X. Tonight's event is reporting during tumultuous times, how reporters could stay safe. Moderating this evening is Scott Britton, who is an assistant professor at Hofstra University and the immediate past president of the Press Club of Long Island. And also moderating is Denise Civiletti, the editor and publisher of Riverhead Local. If you would like to rewatch this event after it's done, we will have it available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And Scott, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Brendan. I'd like to introduce our two guests, Lucy Westcott, who is director of the Emergencies Department at the Committee to Protect Journalists, a worldwide organization, and Jay Rosen, New York University journalism professor and Press Think author. Welcome to the two of you, and welcome to our guests at home and our audience at home. I want to dive right in because we only have an hour, and this is a very big topic. So Lucy and Jay, in terms of civil discourse has been a foundation of our democracy. Journalists in large part, depend on civil discourse to do their jobs, to report their stories. How would you describe the state of civil discourse in our country right now? I guess I'll start with Jay and then throw it over to Lucy.
Well, a good way to start is to recognize that the practices in political journalism that became routine in the United States were based on a kind of a implied picture of the two parties, in which the two parties operated in the same way, more or less. They had the same sort of structure to them. They had a chairman, they had a convention, and they did business in the same way, but they had different ideologies, different priorities, different recommendations for the polity. And a lot of the practices that we took for granted were based on that fact. Historians called it the American consensus after the war, where, relatively speaking, there was broad agreement on where the country was going and how it should get there. The Cold War, for example, was approved by Democrats and Republicans, and that buried imagery is behind the expectation that a certain amount of civility would prevail even in tense debates and when people were differing from each other in Congress. And it extended to a kind of set of unwritten rules for how you deal with journalists as well. And now all of the agreements that were based on that kind of buried picture are up in the air, because none of it matters anymore with a Donald Trump-led party that isn't just him anymore. It's a whole way of doing politics that have now distinguished the two parties. And one of the biggest problems we have in journalism now is we have one kind of normal party which is behaving like we've expected political parties to behave. It's got all kinds of problems, all kinds of weaknesses. And then we have a kind of almost a rogue party that is operating on a completely different set of rules. And that asymmetry between those two parties is a huge challenge for newsrooms. So I'll just leave it there. That's one reason why we don't have even the most basic civility in relationships between some journalists and some politicians.
Okay, thank you. Joy, who's just joining us now, want to introduce her. She is a Newsday columnist and associate editor at the paper, longtime Long Islander and all-around hero. So, Joy, just to jump in, we're talking about the state of civil discourse in the country right now. So I'll throw it to Lucy, and then Joy, if you could jump in and offer your thoughts.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you again for everyone for being here today. So from CPJ's perspective, we are of course a global organization, but we absolutely serve the needs of journalists in the United States as well. And actually, I joined CPJ specifically to focus on what I saw as gaps around safety knowledge and information for journalists in the United States, myself being one of them. So how would we describe civil discourse in the US today? I would say polarized, fraught, and anxious. I feel like I've been part of many, many conversations that happened even before the start of 2024, where this upcoming election is seen as this looming existential threat to journalists and the country as a whole. But I've been involved in many conversations about preparing for this election, staying safe while doing so. And it feels almost overwhelming and like an insurmountable task as well. And we can talk a bit more in a minute about, how the polarized and fraught environment has shown up in terms of what journalists face. But certainly the mis and disinformation piece that is very, very prevalent right now is part of that. And then I would say media literacy as well. So perhaps this confused idea of what journalists actually are and what journalism actually is has sort of contributed to that as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Joy.
Well, I would think that this idea of a lack of civil discourse, it's not just on a national level. It has come all the way down to the local level, all the way down to the people you may want to talk to for a local story. Goodness knows I heard enough about fake news. We all heard enough about fake news. Goodness knows that we've heard enough about you're not fair. Goodness knows we've heard enough about you're not on my side. Goodness knows I don't want to talk to you because you're not going to listen. All of that is resonating all the way down to individual reporters and individual communities, even on Long Island, talking to individual people about things that may have nothing to do with politics. And that makes it more difficult. It doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it more difficult.
Denise?
Absolutely. Troy, we've dealt with that here on a very local level, where every question is, well, you're asking me that because you're political, like that's a political, and assuming that you take sides, in any given issue. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, given what the underlying state of civil discourse is in our society, in our political culture, but how does that manifest itself in terms of the different forms of bullying and intimidation that you've seen over the past 5, 10, or even longer, maybe even 20 years? Like, how has that been manifested, and how has that manifestation changed over that period of time? I know, most people here on this panel have been practicing their trade and thinking about this stuff for at least that long. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Jay?
Well, one thing that I would say on that is it used to be assumed that if you had bad relations with reporters or the media, there was a cost to that, and you could be paying that cost by being sort of alienated from a part of the political system. In national politics, reporters and journalists have a place within the system. And it was assumed that if you, for example, were found to have bad facts and you were wrong, the fact that people would publicize your errors was frightening, and people tried to avoid that situation. They tried to avoid being on the wrong side of journalists without giving up any of their fundamental beliefs and without being fake about it. And now it's completely changed, and it's almost the opposite, which is if you don't treat journalists like dogs, you aren't going to go very far in Republican politics. And that is a massive switch in political culture, I would say.
If I can jump in, let me just
Sure.
say something that happened at a meeting 2 days ago. I'm going to quote the head of a public organization, a hospital. He held a town hall meeting, and he's talking. He went after Newsday, which is not uncommon. We've had that happen before. Citing articles, editorials, and opinion pieces, which is with which he disagreed. But here's what's new. Here's the new twist. Quote, I'm quoting him directly. I'll keep a list. All the reporters who write crappy things, we should all follow for the rest of their lives. Keep a list. I'm going to follow them, just like I'm going to follow some politicians. That would have been unheard of. But that was par for the course. I mean, people have disagreed with Newsday. I've been here now 41 years. People disagreed with us. People, stood up and showed toilet paper rolls. This is what Newsday, paper towels, but I've seen all of that. But this is an implicit threat that if you wrote something that I disagreed with, I'm going to follow you for the rest of your life. It's astonishing. And it's local.
Yeah.
That's really
Lucy?
chilling, Joy. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for sharing that quote and for reading it out. If I can kind of zoom out to a more national level and speak a little bit about what we have documented at CPJ, certainly over the past several years, I think this really again speaks to kind of a loss of trust in institutions that I think has been happening for some time, but really accelerated during COVID. And before I joined this panel today, I went back to a really great resource that I would encourage everyone here to look at. It's something called the US Press Freedom Tracker. And this is a database that was created in 2017 that tracks all press freedom violations that happen in the US, whether that's an arrest to a subpoena to an assault. And I wanted to focus on what they call a chilling statement. So it's really public threats made to reporters or media organizations, either by politicians or other authorities, as well as members of the public. And Joy, I think the quote you just read out is a very, very good example of a chilling statement in this case. I looked up as well in the Press Freedom Tracker any incidents specific to Long Island. And there was a video that I remember watching at the time of reporter Kevin Vasey. And many people here may have seen it, but he was walking through a crowd at a protest and was just getting insults, traitor, you're the virus, fake news, just coming at him. And this was an anti-lockdown protest back in 2020. But watching that again today made me feel so anxious, and it's just an awful thing to watch. And that was amplified, I believe, by the former president on Twitter as well at the time. We have also seen examples of and have reported at CPJ on really people destroying property or threatening violence because of coverage they were not happy with. This happened, for example, with a number of local radio journalists in New Hampshire. One of those reporters got a brick through the window. And then this idea as well that routine news gathering is considered stalking. And again, it goes back to that idea of the role of journalists and how news is gathered and how people may take that or choose to take that the wrong way. There's an example from last year of a couple of journalists in Los Angeles who door knocked several police officers because of a report that they were doing, and then the police union tweeted the names and photos of those journalists and kind of said, these are people you need to watch out for. So I would also say as well that the protests of 2020 across the US for Black Lives Matter were a real turning point as well, I think, in how journalists in this country, especially, were on the receiving end of some terrible arrests and press freedom violations too.
Thank you, Lucy. As you were speaking, I was thinking about sort of one of the classical roles of a journalist to do shoe leather journalism, to go door to door, and how once upon a time that wasn't considered especially dangerous. But there was always some degree of risk, but not especially dangerous. But in recent years, we've seen where people have been shot simply knocking on somebody's door. So that's a frightening thought as you were speaking, that sort of just went through my mind. But I want to talk a little bit about what the effect has been on journalists. I guess I want to start with Joy, who's in a newsroom now. Like, how are journalists coping with this? How are they handling this? Is it having an effect on their work? What are your thoughts?
Well, I would point out that in that auditorium where that guy stood up, we did have a reporter. She asked a question, was booed. And when he didn't answer the question, she asked a follow-up question. She was nonplussed by this. That said, I haven't talked to the reporter whose story was blasted up on the screen as, Newsday lies. So people are doing their jobs. I think also, though, people are doing more than the usual preparation for your jobs. If you're going to go out someplace, if you're going to talk to a group of people, it doesn't mean, the one thing it does not mean is that we don't go. The one thing it does not mean is that we don't talk to people. We may call in advance, we may try to work, we may go with somebody else and not necessarily by ourselves, but it has not stopped us from reporting. But the flip side of that is what happens when you get back into the office. And we have had people who work at Newsday who were impacted by the 2020 protests on Long Island. We have had people in the office who have been impacted terribly by some of the cyberbullying that's going on, people who have been picked on, people who have been, and this is the other part, they can find out anything they want about any of us unless we're very, very careful. So we've had people who are, somebody call them up and say, hey, I know that you do this, that, and the other thing. So we talk to each other, we support each other. Newsday supports us. We have a very a vigorous safety team there. If there's something that's perceived as a threat, you know who to talk to, or sometimes they've even come to us saying, hey, we noticed this. Is this a problem for you? Do you think you need something? And we moved into a new building, I should also point out, and this is after the killings in Annapolis. I grew up not too far from there. Our building, safety, 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 safety. A few months ago, we got an announcement to leave the building and go home. It's because security saw something suspicious. They didn't wait. They cleared the building immediately and just sent us home. And I'm happy that they did that. Turns out that it wasn't anything, but they were not willing to take any kind of chance with the safety, not just of reporters, but anybody who was in that building at that time.
And Joy, but you were referring to the Capitol Gazette murders that occurred
Yes.
in 2008.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Lucy and Jay, what are your thoughts? I know you're not in newsrooms, but you work with journalists all the time. So what are your thoughts? What have you heard?
Go ahead, Lucy.
Thanks, Jay. Joy, I'm really glad to hear that Newsday takes your safety seriously. That's really fantastic. And well, I'll start by saying that at the start of this year, one of the great things that CPJ does, and my team in particular, is we provide safety training and safety workshops for journalists all around the world, primarily focusing on physical and digital safety. We have seen a quite pronounced uptick in the number of US news organizations, US news outlets who've contacted us seeking that type of training this year. Now, not all of that training is related to the upcoming election, But what I think is happening is that this election is really causing journalists, newsroom managers, newsroom leadership to think we need to be up to date on our journalist safety. I think that this, the bullying and intimidation and what we've been speaking about in my research and my reporting at CPJ, I have heard from journalists in this country that, the online harassment piece that Joy was speaking about, which is very important, and other forms of harassment can sometimes make journalists want to move off of their beats to something that is kind of less risky. There is the horrible spectre of having to leave the profession altogether because you just don't want to deal with it anymore. I always worry about younger journalists as well, and what the effect might be for them going in. So I do think there is a pronounced effect for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that has happened in our political sphere and broader public culture is, and this is a big result of the problem of misinformation and disinformation. But to the extent that your identity or your political identity is based on a lie or something that's not true, something that the facts don't verify, you are, in a way, a threat to people if you're a journalist representing truth. If people have based their public opinions and their political beliefs on misinformation, then journalists are going to ask about that, and they're not going to yield to your belief if you're wrong. And that switch from information to identity is what is causing what people usually refer to as polarization. Polarization is an effect of this change. And so it's not just that the former president tells a lot of untruths himself. That's a part of it. That's a hard thing to deal with, because there again, we have a revolution. It used to be that if you were fact checked and you were wrong, you changed what you were saying. Now you just keep saying it, right? That's big difference. But in so far as misinformation and disinformation have kind of taken over people's identities, they see journalists as a threat, not just to their beliefs, but to who they are. That's much deeper and harder to change.
So how do we deal with that as reporters in the field, on a beat, interviewing local officials or national, like how do we cope with that, and how do we deal with that as a profession, as an individual reporter?
I don't, as I said, I don't know the answer
Don't
to
say
that. And I
that.
wouldn't go into it assuming that there necessarily is
An
a
answer.
way because some things are more powerful than, our behavior. I mean, you can say be polite. That may not work at all.
Mm.
I think it is good to always have ready genuine questions, which is things that you want to ask people where you don't know the answer and you would like to know the answer, and to project that sincerity, like, I'm not just fooling around here, I'm not trying to embarrass you, I'm not engaged in some ritual, I just want to know what you think. And if you can communicate that along with a sense of humor sometimes, or be skilled at deflecting, that might help a little. But it could just as easily be exactly the opposite. You could be doing a very effective job and be attacked anyway.
Do you think this has changed? I'm sorry, Joy, go.
I was going to say, one of the things I think I find helpful on the local level is something an editor told me a long time ago. We write about people and then we're right back out there with them, right?
Mhm.
It's something that you feel, especially when you cover, say, it's like when you go to a court case. You can write something and you're right there, something about the judge or somebody, you're right there the next day with them. I think on a local level, because we're right there the next day with them, I think that showing up, keeping talking, letting them know that you're not going to go away. Pretty early on in my time here, I was told that there was some people who would not speak to Newsday. And what I did was, because I'm a Southerner and we're polite, is I got a stack of business cards and I went over and visited everybody's office and I said, "Hi, it's me. Here's my card. I'm new. I understand that you all don't like us, and that's okay. It's fine. You don't have to speak to me, but just know I'm going to call you. Up to you whether you want to talk back to me, but I'm going to call you." And that's exactly what I did. And I think that the relationships that I had then have served me well now, because people understand I'm not going to be making any assumptions. If I was writing something critical, I would say, "Look, this is what it looks like to me. Talk me out of it." And they would get on the phone, and sometimes people say, "You're right. I can't argue with you." I just think that the advantage we have on a local level is that we're not going anywhere. I have to go back out day in, day out. And I think that sometimes that can get a little bit more difficult if people are all up in your face or yelling or whatever. But the fact that you're not going anywhere, I think does a lot. Familiarity may breed contempt, but familiarity also breeds, "I'm not going anywhere. It's up to you whether you want to talk to me, but I'm there, and we're going to be there."
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing that's very related to what Joy just said? In the United States culture of journalism, it was for a long time, maybe in many places it still is, a rule that you don't read your quotes to people in advance of the publication of your article. And American journalists, I think, on the whole, did not know that many other countries have different rules on that. If you are a journalist in Germany, I was going to say West Germany, that's how old I am. But in Germany, it is standard practice to read the quotes you're going to use to a public figure back. And then there's some negotiation sometimes about saying it perfectly so that both sides are satisfied. That might be something American journalists would in this climate that we're describing, benefit from. But it's not the way practice was taught or learned when I entered the journalism education profession.
If I could just go back to something that Joy said as well, this the local journalism piece. I think, yes, there are absolutely advantages to being in the community and to people knowing who you are and you're not leaving, and so that's super important. I think on the flip side as well, and if we can go back to that video of Kevin Vasey, the people in that video knew him because he's on their TV. Like, there's a familiarity that they feel they can then attack him. They know his channel. They can say, "You used to be good. We used to trust you." And I think there is a safety component there as well. I did a report many years ago about local broadcast journalists, women in particular, who did face quite terrible harassment because, again, they are just known within the community. So I think there's always a safety angle there too that's really, really important.
And I just want to point out that in that video with Kevin, I don't know if you noticed, if you saw their police officers standing right there, and they're just letting him be surrounded. And again, that would have been an experience of some of our people who were out there in the field. And Kevin, by the way, was known more for sports. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? So they were kind of like, "We liked you as a sports. We don't like you out here doing this, dude." No, it was terrifying to watch. That was utterly terrifying. Yes. And what made it even worse was to see that there were police officers there who did not come over and say, "Hey, at least on the part of the video that I saw."
Well, earlier Joy spoke about the Capitol Gazette shooting, mass shooting in 2018. You know, Joy, maybe you could talk a little bit about, without disclosing any type of specifics, of course, you know, what can newsrooms be doing, and what is a newsroom like Newsday doing to prevent this type of violence? Because of course, journalists have always faced intimidation to one degree or another. It's been amplified in recent years. I think there's no doubt about that. But I think what's becoming more and more real is the possibility of violence in the United States, which is somewhat unheard of in journalism. So what are newsrooms doing, and what can they do to prevent actual violence?
Well, there's some things they do that I'm not going to tell you, obviously.
Of course,
but,
yeah.
But I can tell you that, and I think other newsrooms, especially after the Capitol Gazette, you know, you have your ID. They know who's in the building. There are cameras all over the place. You know, and those cameras do more than take a wide view. They can do all kinds of other things. If I'm going to bring a visitor, they'd like to know the day before if I'm bringing a visitor. And if someone's coming in, say, as we had before, a former police commissioner, and they're bringing their deputy, those people are armed. We need to know that we need to know that kind of very, very specific information. And as I say, there's communication with us in the building. You know, they didn't just buzz all of our telephones. We knew that we were supposed to get out of the building. So they're able to talk to us in real time too. I think that's another advantage. But I can tell you, I know that a lot went into that new building that we're in, and that it was safety, 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 and more safety.
That's reassuring. Lucy and Jay, what are your thoughts? What can newsrooms do to guard against actual violence?
Well, I think in addition to what Joy has said, and I know that you can't give those specifics away, nor should you, I think it's important to note that in the Capitol Gazette situation, there were threats made online by the shooter ahead of time. And I'm not saying that, you know, catching those early on would have prevented what was an absolutely awful massacre. But I think newsrooms do need to take the online piece very, very seriously, because we know that online violence or online harassment, the targeting of journalists online, can very easily tip over into a real world setting. I think, you know, newsrooms, physical spaces, buildings, having a very, very strong plan in place, perhaps having a panic button, knowing the local law enforcement, having a direct contact there, and regularly checking in is probably a generally good rule of thumb. And then more generally, having solid plans in place that look at safety from a holistic point of view. We're talking about physical safety here, yes, but we're also talking about digital safety, and then what we call the psychosocial or mental health piece as well. At CPJ, we see all these types of safety as overlapping. And one very, very important thing for when you're going out on assignment is undergoing the risk assessment process. This is a very simple thing you can do that a lot of journalists can really benefit from. It doesn't need to be for an assignment that's particularly risky. Like, I mean, you should obviously do it for something like a protest, but even just going out into the field, having a talk with your editor, with a colleague, these are the risks that I might face. Here's how I'm going to deal with them. That's something that we would love to really stress and see more journalists do.
What kinds of risks would journalists best think about when doing that risk assessment process? What should we be?
Yeah, so again, it's generally breaking down into physical, digital, psychosocial. So am I out there reporting alone? And if so, you know, is that going to present a risk for me? Should I have a colleague out here as well? Generally, the answer is yes. What equipment am I taking with me? is that going to present a risk to me? Am I going to have any situational awareness if I have a big camera and I'm doing interviews at the same time? Does there need to be someone else with me too? Consideration should be taken around identifying yourself as press. That's really a case-by-case basis. You should always have your press credentials on you. We saw during the protests of 2020 how many law enforcement officers across the country just routinely ignored the press credential, or being told that somebody was a journalist and that the arrest happened anyway. But in some cases, being identified as press can actually put a target on your back. So that's something to really consider as well. Your devices. Is there a risk that your device can be seized and searched by a law enforcement officer or a member of the public? Is there anything on that phone that would put you or a source at risk if somebody were to open your phone? It's things like that. Making sure, for example, as well, that you turn off Face ID or any kind of biometric opening of your phone, because someone can just put that in front of your face and open it. I'm happy to share our templates after this as well, because I think it'll be very, very useful.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I would say also that this is another area where the dramatic changes have occurred. It used to be that throughout the police system, the justice system, the Department of Justice, it was a identifiable priority to treat journalists as a different category than other people because they had an important role in informing the entire society. So for example, the Justice Department has guidelines for prosecution of journalists that are different than other groups, because it's really dicey and tricky to go around arresting journalists. You get into a lot of trouble that way. The First Amendment is very powerful. And it was the same thing with journalists and police. There was an understanding there that they're both kind of on the job, and therefore there's a kind of a connection there. And now all of these things are becoming just inflammatory in themselves. And you can almost hear the cries for, like no special rights for journalists, which does signify a shift. And so you can't ignore those things. You can't hold them back. As an individual, nobody is going to be able to change that situation. But I think it is important to safety to realize just how dramatically the culture around journalism has been changed by a kind of radicalism.
Well, and now at home, if anybody has questions that they want to put into a chat, we'd be happy to take questions. And I think, Denise, you have another question.
We were kicking around the idea of talking about what can journalists do to support one another in their newsrooms and in their lives in coping with this, anxiety producing environment that we work in day to day.
I think you talk to each other, and you got to remember there was a pandemic in the middle here. You can't forget that. You just absolutely cannot forget that. So you've got people not used to people coming up to their doors, right? You've got some reporters who went on the street to cover protests, right? And you had other reporters who were able to manage their beats from home. So you've got all this, to some extent, we're kind of starting anew to that way. But I think that some of the, as an editor, you want to talk to your people. I know that if people have concerns, and we've had some discussions among us, about, women and what are we getting online? People of color, what's coming after us? Muslims, goodness, what are we getting? Since the Hamas Israeli war, what are Jewish people getting? What are Muslim people getting? I mean, it's crazy out there.
Yeah, everything's
And
ramped
I
up.
think that when people recognize that, they're not going through this alone, that if it's something that is particularly disturbing to them, that, as an editor, I can notify somebody else and say, hey, I'm worried about her. Somebody called her, said something about the color of this kid she put on a cover someplace. And she's really it has really rattled her. I think the other thing to consider here, Jay, Lucy, we all came through a system, the farm system, where you started off at a small publication and then you kind of worked your way up. So you kind of got used to, if somebody didn't want to talk to you and ran you off the porch, okay. If somebody did this, okay. These younger generations, they didn't go through the farm system. They didn't have that kind of so-called seasoning. And you have to understand that the definition of journalist is also stretched. So I think their experience, and I think we have to be very, very much aware of that as editors and as colleagues, it's going to be very, very different from ours because they're coming for the first time up against, say, bullying or threats, where some of us have had that in some form or fashion over decades. And, when it comes for me, I'm going to handle it a little differently than somebody who is new to journalism and saying, oh my God. So I think that's something else that we really, really, really need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's a great point. The question was, how can journalists help each other through these difficulties? And I think one answer to that is they can change their own culture, which is sort of what Joy was saying. When I started as a professional student of American journalism, one of the things that really jumped out at me was that in the professional culture of American journalism, especially the newspaper culture, by far the number one value was toughness. That is what marked a good journalist, is their toughness. And probably the second one was competition, beating the other guys to the story. And it was almost like a uniform culture, because it was so persistent from newsroom to newsroom, and it really wasn't any different in Idaho than it was in Long Island. And now that is not appropriate. People need a lot more than toughness, and they need a lot more than just beating the other guy to the story. And I think you're totally right that the new generation coming into newsrooms now not only doesn't have those experiences that you talked about, but they actually need more, and they expect there to be a more welcoming culture, welcoming for things that are very difficult for them to talk about. That's become part of what they demand in order to remain in your employ.
And they should.
Yeah, and they're doing it the right way.
And they should. But I think going back to that question, yes, talking to each other is very important, but I think also making sure that the newsroom, the editors are giving space for those younger journalists, or any journalists really, to speak about what they're experiencing. I think that was, for a long time, to Jay's point, this feeling that if I say as a journalist that I experienced something and I didn't quite like it or it affected me, that makes me look weak. I'm not going to get the next assignment, and there's going to be kind of a mark against me. And I do think that that tide is turning for the better. But I think also, not only speaking to colleagues in your own newsroom, but colleagues in your town, in your city, across the country, they have the tips, they have been through this and have managed to, improve their online safety, and they know what to pack in their bag when to go and cover a protest, and they might have the name of an organization that can help with some mental health piece of this too. So talking and communication is really important.
And acknowledging that this is an issue.
Yes.
which goes right back to the point that Jay talked about. It's you need more than a skin you need more than a thick skin these days. You need tools on how to talk to people who don't want to talk to you, tools on how to handle a situation that you feel is going to go out of control. And you also need, okay, listen, I'm scared to go over here by myself. And I don't think it's enough that, my buddy here wants to go with me. But I think this is something that we need to cover. What organization are you going to do to help me do my job in that kind of situation? And we would have never had those discussions ever, not even 5 years ago.
Yeah. It was a monoculture.
Well, I guess as a follow-up to that, are there any, because we've talked a lot about protecting oneself in the workplace, but of course, journalists are in a sense public figures. So people know who they are, they know where they live, they know their phone number, all of these things, and all of these things are easily found today. Are there any specific measures that journalists should take, for their physical and mental, psychosocial safety at home?
So I'm going to plug something called Delete Me, and there are many iterations of this, but Delete Me is kind of the go-to one for journalists. I use it. I see Joy nodding. She knows what I'm talking about. So yes, people can find your phone number, but you can take steps to get that removed off the internet. Every time you make some kind of transaction on the internet or put your personal details into something for some reason, that information can be bought and sold on millions of these data broker websites. This seems to be a particularly uniquely American issue. That information then can, of course, be weaponized against journalists. That's often how journalists are doxxed. Not to mention, it's how friends and family can also be brought into that horror as well. So as journalists, look up Delete Me or something else. That IDX is another one. You plug the information into it that you don't want online. So that can be personal phone number, personal email address, current format addresses. It will then scrape that from the internet and will kind of do it on a rolling basis. It's very, very valuable for everyone, not just journalists, but we know and we have seen time and time again how your phone number just being out there can be bought and then it can really be used to harm you. So I think if anyone's going to take one safety tip away from today, it would be to put that into practice. Do you use it, Joy?
Oh yeah, when my kids were younger, I scraped and, you do the Google search on yourself and see if there's anything out there. You do the dark web search, see if there's anything out there. And you can go through, they can even, on the street where you live, they can, fuzz up what your house looks like. Now, we've not done any great training in that. I'm a nerd, so maybe that kind of helps with this thing. But I do think that we have to be aware of that. And I think that we have to take measures ourselves to protect ourselves out. But I also want to add something to it. Jay kind of alluded to this. Our role when I first got into it, we were supposed to be observers, right? Observers, observers. And, that was always fake. That was always a fallacy. Because what we observe is through eyes that have seen some things and you assume other things. One thing I found that has helped me a lot is that I'm actually active in community, which would have been something that was very, very,
Forbidden.
very much.
Yeah.
You weren't
Sure.
supposed to do that. You're supposed to be pure as the driven snow.
Right.
But people know me. They know me as a swim instructor. They know me as a lifeguard. They've seen me here. I'm over here. I'm over there. So somehow, I personally think it makes it easier. I remember once being introduced at a function and somebody said, Joy Brown, blah, 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 blah. And they say she's an active member of the community too. And I thought, that's it.
Okay. Well, now I want to go to our Q&A questions from our audience, of which there are a number of them. So why don't we get started, at least plugging through at least some of them. And I guess I want to begin with probably the youngest member of the audience. He's one of my students, Michael Zavatsky. He has a very important question. Is this violence against journalists something that is inevitable and likely to just keep increasing? Or are there any changes that can be made through their work or legislation? I guess he's asking in terms of how can we as journalists fight back essentially against violence against journalists? Any one of you could. Why don't we turn to Lucy, because that's pretty much what your organization does, right?
Yes, it is. I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think it has to be inevitable. I think the way to combat this is to make sure that journalists, their colleagues, and their newsrooms feel empowered and have the tools to go out and continue doing the extremely important job, especially in this day and age of journalism. I think there was a comment in here as well about is it worth journalists going out into the community and talking more about themselves and what they do and how they do it? And I don't want to say that that's something that will prevent violence or arrest or anything like that, but I do think that this all comes back to better media literacy and understanding of journalism as a profession. I think also the more that we actually write about ourselves as journalists and as an industry, which is not something I think that any of us like to do, and certainly going back, Jay, to your kind of rules of journalism, it tends to be we don't want to be the story, but increasingly we are the story as journalists, and as there are massive arrests and again that violence. So making sure that there's also reporting on this so that the public knows what is going on, and that is something that my organization and many others do as well. So we take all press freedom violations seriously. We want to write about them, advocate on behalf of journalists. So telling the US Press Freedom Tracker, telling other organizations in the US is also something very smart.
Very nice. I have a message here from George Giocas.
Yeah. Hey, George.
Okay.
Sorry,
And
former Newsday.
hi, Joy. Back in the day when I was at the paper, we actually went out to the community and talked about how we gathered the news and introduced the beat reporters in their community. Is that still happening? And if not, do you see that happening at all, helping at all these days?
Well, George, I want you to remember a couple of things. COVID. And, we've repopulated our town beats. Our reporters are out there. Reporters are, we're seeing town reporters. We have Newsday TV now. So people, you can see your reporter, you can hear what your reporter is saying. We're trying to do that. And we just went through an entire marketing thing where you can actually go on a page in Newsday and you can hear all of us talk about ourselves, why we do what we do, what beat we cover, why it's important to us. They have done all of that. In terms of going out to speak to community, you'll be happy to know I'll be speaking at the Girl Scout annual luncheon next week. We have had other reporters go out and speak to other groups. I would imagine that's going to keep going. And in addition to that, George, we have groups come in and speak to our reporters and to our editors. And what we want them to tell us is, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? But I guess the biggest change since you were here is we have metrics. We know what our audience thinks about us. We know what our audience thinks about stories. We know what they like. We know what they don't like. We know what they want. We know what they don't want. So in a weird kind, well, not weird, but in a 21st century kind of way, we are more responsive to our audience, or I should say our segmented audience, than we ever have been before. They come back at us, we go back at them. It really is a conversation at this point.
Nice. I have another student from another of mine who has a question. Antonio Schoenhart, and I guess I'll direct this one to Lucy because you'd spoken about this question before. Should one-man band journalist become a thing of the past, even though it seems to be preferred, be much easier to avoid conflict by having a crew instead of being by yourself?
This one thing I don't think we did touch on today is kind of the economic precarity piece of the journalism industry currently. I mean, that's a global phenomenon, unfortunately, and how that does relate and how that relates to journalist safety. We often talk about one-man bands as being sort of inherently dangerous and sort of unavoidable, but I do think that having someone else with you is very, very beneficial. Again, if you think about what a one-man band or a MMJ multimedia journalist is doing, their focus is entirely on the task at hand and this situational awareness. So that ability to see, around you, pay attention to your senses is diminished because you are on your own. So while I don't think it should necessarily become a thing of the past, I think it can certainly evolve to the current climate that we're in, and wherever possible, having an additional person would be safer. There may be conflict still, but there's someone else there with you, and it's easier to de-escalate then.
Certainly for those bigger stories, protests where where there's the potential for violence of some kind, or major events where there's the potential for violence, you would want to be as a crew, or at least one other person. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Let me just see here. I have a question here from Barbara Preston. She is an editor with a community newspaper in Princeton, New Jersey. And she says, I am having problems with a small but vocal group of MAGA, I guess I'll direct this one to Jay, MAGA conservatives who attend school board meetings in a town I cover. In addition to calling me a liar and stupid and lazy online, they text my cell phone at 1 a.m. They write to my publisher telling him I'm biased and unprofessional and that he should replace me as the editor. They burned my newspaper online on Facebook. I would not run a letter to the editor by one man named Jeff because it was full of untruths. Jeff told me I will experience the full wrath and fury of him. They also bring me up to a topic at meetings saying that I should not be allowed to take photos or quote people at meetings because it makes people afraid to speak at meetings. Help. How worried should I be? Jay, I know you've spoken quite a bit about the MAGA movement and its effect on journalism. How worried should a journalist like Barbara be? And
well, I think it's
anything
important
that she could do about it, I guess I would direct that to Jay and Lucy.
Thanks. It seems to me that what you have to watch out for is not somebody who's a supporter of Donald Trump or who says I'm MAGA, but someone for whom this has sunk in and become their identity, and their rage at you is part of a larger rage they have in society. It's almost like you need a nose for the psychology of a hater, because in some ways, not all, but some ways, MAGA is a hate movement, and it definitely treats journalists as a hate object. And that is one lesson people take away from the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Rhetoric is not a good word for it, but that's what it is. It's the way he talks and presents himself. So Trump took existing dissatisfaction with the media, took it way away from the previous situation, which was a concern about bias, and taught his supporters not only that the news media is biased, but they are the enemies of the MAGA movement, and that everything they say has to be doubted. And he went one step further and said, they criticize me, the media criticizes me because they hate you. This is a formula that he uses not once or twice, but regularly. And so that doesn't help, except that if you know you are in the grip of somebody with those kinds of beliefs, don't expect your charm, for example, or your patience to be an adequate response.
Lucy, any Barbara?
Yeah, this Barbara, I'm truly sorry that you're dealing with this, first of all. This sounds like a mess, and one that is very frightening as well. Texting your cell phone at 1 a.m., I think putting some, first of all, on the digital safety piece, doing the best that you can to make sure that anything personal about you, this is in addition to the delete me piece, but any public facing, not locked social media, I would suggest you do lock that down. And anything personal that can be used against you, family members' names, photos, friends' names and photos, things that you're tagged in, I would spend a bit of time just trying to get information off of the internet about you taken away. It then lessens the likelihood that these folks can weaponize that against you. You say that they're writing to your publisher. I certainly hope that there is a line of communication there, and maybe there can be some kind of public statement or something put out kind of addressing the harassment that you are receiving. And then when you do go to meetings and you do your job, which is taking photos and quoting people at said meetings, bringing someone else with you again to perhaps document or to just have your back, so that you aren't alone in those settings. How worried should you be? That I cannot say, but I would like to say that you can always email us as well and talk to us about this, because this sounds really scary.
If I can jump in here, Barbara, it sounds like you're being bullied and you're being threatened. One thing I might do is get a Google phone number, and make that your professional phone number. Go to Google, you'll be able to choose your area code. That's the phone number that you want people to call you on. I would block this man's phone number. If you have no reason to speak to him, you have no reason to listen to him. It's like an unwelcome knock at the door. You don't have to answer it. In terms of public meetings where there are other people who are around, I don't know which public meetings there are, and I don't know who's in charge of those public meetings, but I do not think it unreasonable to have someone from your organization, and maybe it is the publisher, speak to the head of that meeting and say, yo, is this what you allow in a public meeting? You're going to need some allies in all of this. And I would also talk to your publisher, and I'd be very frank. If indeed you feel that you are being bullied, harassed, and threatened, they need to know that. And they need to understand that. And they need to understand that within the context of everything that Jay is talking about and everything we're talking about in this panel. Because the publisher has an obligation, the organization has an obligation to see to your safety too. And it doesn't help, Barbara, that you're a woman. People think for some reason that it's really, really okay to do this to women. I personally want to encourage you to reach out to Lucy. And I also want to let you know that you're not alone here. I mean, I see you, and you should not have to put up with that kind of, you have to do your job under that kind of cloud. It is unconscionable.
Absolutely. Well, we're at 8 o'clock, and we have more questions than I think can be answered tonight. But I do have one last question that if we can give it just maybe 5 more minutes, if everybody's okay with that, from Angel Ravello, who's a graduate student of mine, and I think it would be a good question to end on, which is why I'm asking. Journalists are the first line of defense in a democracy. This is signaling that we may descend into authoritarianism, this violence that is, or potential threat of violence. How do you report on issues that are morally important but politically polarizing? How do you maintain your integrity while also keeping the public informed? Why don't we start with Jay, and we could round out with everybody else.
I think you have to be relentlessly factual. You have to be open to being wrong, but tough and insistent when you're right. And I think you have to realize that people are like this description we just had of a group of harassers. They're like that because they have been essentially taught by politicians that it's okay, that it's effective, that it's quote unquote normal. And that only teaches us there's an even greater need for truth telling in journalism, because we're losing some of our democracy. We're losing our open society from normalizing this kind of behavior. And there's no cure for being on the front lines, as journalists are indeed on the front lines. There's no, the only way to change that would be to leave the profession. And I think there's still a lot of people I know, because they become my students. There's still a lot of people who understand the importance of that calling and hear it. And so I don't have good answers for you, except that what you're doing is really important. Journalists are the first lines in some ways. And we know this because they are among the first things the authoritarians turn to when they capture power. Is one of the first things they do is they go after the TV broadcasters and the journalists who work for them. They shut down the radio and they try to get their friends to buy the newspapers. And there's a reason for that.
Lucy and Joy, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah,
Lucy, you wanna take it?
I'll take it. Not much else to add to Jay's fantastic answer, but I think just trust that what you're doing is absolutely vital, and it is important work that you're doing to uphold democracy. I always think that, you know, you are only ever really in control of your own reaction to things. So in terms of, you know, doing this job with integrity and dignity, you can do that. You're in control of that. And if something does, you know, if something does escalate, you have the power to de-escalate. You have the power to do that, and keep going, but take preventative safety steps where necessary. Safety is empowerment, and that will empower you to keep doing that job of keeping the public informed while maintaining your integrity.
Thank you. Joy?
And I would just add to that your work, I think the work becomes extraordinarily important. You want to be informed. You want to know what you're writing or reporting. You need to know that, and you need to be able to relay that in an authoritative way that provides the proper context. And what do I mean by that? It's okay, I think, to in reporting point out, okay, so this is politics and this is policy, because they're two separate things that we keep mushing them together, which is one thing that drives me crazy. It's okay not to take statements from people. I hate statements because I can't ask for clarification and I can't ask a statement questions. I hate them. I hate them. And the other thing I think that we have to stay away from is this, and Jay has spoken on this idea of what we grew up with was professionally was this idea of fairness. One side says one thing, the other side says another thing. There's false equivalency here now, which means that you have to be more sophisticated, and how as sophisticated as you are authoritative in terms of your work. And it's not easy because you have to dig deep and know what you're talking about. You have to know when somebody gives you a statement that makes no sense. Okay, that's what they're saying, but you need to be able to say, okay, but this is what that means within context. That's what I would add to it.
Okay. Thank you. On behalf of everyone at the Press Club of Long Island, we want to thank our guests, Lucy Westcott, Joy Brown, and Jay Rosen, for a thought-provoking and very important conversation. Denise, would you like to close it?
Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And thank you especially to our panelists. It was really informative and good time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Stay strong.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.